Okay, if you're trying to capture color and light in oils the way painters like Soroya do, and you feel like you've been stuck at the same plateau for a long time, I want to start by naming the real issue. If your current strategy is to make more paintings with bold colors, buy more tubes of paint, or watch more YouTube videos on color theory or oil painting, hoping that color and light just eventually click, that strategy is actually what's keeping you stuck. Not because capturing color and light is outside of your grasp, but because oil painting has one key flaw that makes it unusually hard to learn. See, painting is a low feedback skill. Let me explain what I mean by that. We learn fastest in skills where feedback is obvious and immediate. So if you miss a note on a violin, you hear it instantly. If you miss a free throw, you know right away. But painting doesn't work like that. Most of the time, you don't know what is wrong while you're painting, only that something feels off. So you just keep going, adjust, guess, overwork, and hope it'll turn out. Without clear and immediate feedback, you can practice for years and still never know why things aren't working. This is why so many skilled, serious painters plateau at the pretty good stage and stay there. So in this video, I'm going to show you the best system to paint gorgeous light and get clear, immediate feedback while you're mixing color so you can capture exactly the color you want. To go along with it, I'm going to include a step-by-step walkthrough of what I share today, plus all of the exercises that I recommend my students do that I couldn't fit in here. If you want to master color mixing and light once and for all, grab it down in the description. So if you're new here, my name is Chelsea. I'm a self-taught oil painter, and loose expressive painting, and especially capturing stunning color and light, is very much my thing. And I used this feedback-first approach that I'm going to share with you to take my own work from the hobbyist level to winning an Oil Painters of America gold medal in under 7 years. And I now teach this process to painters who feel stuck at that same plateau. And after helping hundreds of painters through this, when I hear an artist say, "I want to paint color and light like Soroya," I've learned the issue usually isn't that they just don't know enough color theory or they just don't care enough about practicing color and light. It's that the vision of color and light that they want to capture is just still too vague. So they don't have a specific palette in mind. They don't mean a specific value range. They don't mean a specific temperature relationship. They mean a feeling. And that's the problem, because feelings can't give you concrete feedback, just vibes. If I asked you right now, what exact colors would you need to mix to get the kind of light that you want? You probably could guess, but you couldn't tell me with 100% certainty. Not because you're incapable, but because you've never defined the target clearly enough to test against it. But color and light aren't vibes. They're not abstract ideas. They're physical, quantifiable things. And until you anchor the color you mix against a concrete goal, there's no way to know whether you're right or wrong while painting. And that's how we wind up painting chalk or mud. So before we talk about technique, exercises, or palettes, we have to solve one thing first. And that is, what exactly are you aiming at? For me, that answer lives in a small handful of paintings. Images where the light, the temperature shifts, and the color relationships are just so striking that I know this is exactly what I want to have in my work. And this is where a lot of painters accidentally sabotage themselves. They admire painters like Soroya, but they practice from references that don't live in the same universe. So here's what happens. Let's say you love sun-drenched, high-chroma outdoor compositions, but your reference photo is a dimly lit indoor portrait that you took with your iPhone. And so now you're having to invent the light, the color relationships, the temperature shifts, the mood, basically everything that defines color all at once. That's not a skill gap. That's just an impossible task. You can't apply beautiful color and light to a bad reference because the information simply isn't there, and no amount of taste, talent, or theory can replace missing data. So, If your reference doesn't already contain the color and light you're trying to learn, you're not really practicing, you're just guessing. So the first real shift that has to happen is this. Your reference has to already be doing the thing that you want to learn. That's why when I'm training my eye for color and light, I actually don't start with photos at all. And no, I'm not going to paint from life either. I start with the paintings I love themselves. So here's why the answer is studying paintings, not inventing them. Not because we're copying the style of those paintings, but because we're honoring the fact that another painter has actually solved this problem for us. If you start with a painting that you love for its color and light, by definition, it already contains the correct value structure you need, the correct temperature shifts, the right color compression, the correct exaggeration of that color. All of the decisions have already been made, which means instead of inventing, you can compare. Instead of guessing, you can test. And instead of hoping, you can know. And once you have a known answer, that's when feedback becomes immediate. That's the whole game. In the case of these paintings, what I see over and over again is that, yes, Sorolla has some very intense color in here. All of these have a color scheme that's complementary blue-orange. Of course, there are some nuances here, but if you just look at how vibrant we get in the blues here, and how we nonetheless have these really strong pops of warmth in the skin, the swim trunks, or the sails of the boat, you can really see this in action. But despite how vibrant and opposite these colors are, they don't clash, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to describe these colors as garish. That's because Sorolla is really careful to balance high chroma pops of color with really grounded, dull colors. Take this young boy, for instance. There are a ton of grays and browns in here. We read it as being bright color, but when we actually check this color in a minute, you will see that it's actually much duller than you think. And I think this reinforces the need for really great reference material. The color feels truly believable in all of these, and it's because the scene that Sorolla painted was based on the color he was seeing in life. I don't think you could expect a horse in its stable to have these same pops of blue or orange in its coat, or someone seated in a dimly lit room to have the same vibrant peachiness to their skin, or the same notes of blue and purple in the shadows of those skin tones. But getting the right reference is another video. And as anyone who has painted before knows, even with a great reference, there's still a much bigger issue we have to solve. How do you know, while you're painting, whether you're actually seeing and mixing the right color? See, most painters just guess, but we are not most painters. Instead of guessing, we're going to engineer our feedback. Here's how that works. What I like to do is to print a painting that represents exactly the kind of color and light that I want. I usually just use Walgreens for this. It's cheap, it's fast, it's convenient, and the prints actually look good. And then I go ahead and I take my print and I put it under a sheet of glass. And that glass is actually going to become my palette. Now, I start with my normal core palette, and then I look at the print and I ask, are there any colors here that are more vibrant than I can mix? Now, in my case, my standard palette goes from this white down to this green. So we're gonna ignore these two here for just a second and pretend that I could only mix with these, the colors that I typically put out for the portrait paintings that I make. And just to walk through what these are, all of these colors are Vasari. I'm starting with titanium white, yellow ochre, terra rosa, ruby red, which is the same thing as like a permanent rose, transparent oxide red, ultramarine blue deep, and viridian. Now, you might notice these are probably not exactly the palette that Sorolla used, and that is okay. That's the beauty of this exercise. You don't have to have the exact palette that your favorite painter used in order to be able to replicate the kind of colors that you see, and I'll show you exactly why. But going back to this list, if I just started at the titanium white and I ended at the viridian, well, I might run into some issues with some of the more vibrant, like oranges or yellows in these particular pieces. So I've gone ahead and I've added just the colors that I felt that I would be missing, nothing more. And I'm thinking about the vibrant colors that I'm mixing. Because one thing about color theory that is really important to know is that typically you can mix dull colors with a lot of different pigment combinations and still have it be successful. But when it comes down to the vibrant colors, if you don't have that color straight out of the tube, chances are you're not going to be able to actually mix it. And that's what we want to avoid. So I've gone ahead and added these two really vibrant colors that I was missing that I think actually would have belonged in one of these two compositions that I'm studying the color and light from. If there are colors in these paintings, just to recap, that are more vibrant than what I can mix with my existing palette, I add only what's missing and nothing more. So now that we've done that, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna pick a tiny area of one of these paintings that I want to match. Now, in my case, I'm actually gonna start with a pretty tricky example, and that's going to be one of these flesh tone colors that are in shadow on this young fisherman. I know from my experience teaching so many painters, anytime someone comes to me with a composition that's a portrait where the subject of that portrait is predominantly in shadow, I usually warn them against it. At least in the beginning. That's not to say that like this is a bad composition or that it's impossible or anything like that. It's simply to say that it is trickier. So let's go ahead and actually use a really tricky example. So to do this, I'm gonna look at this little section of the rib cage, specifically just here around the serratus anterior, and I'm gonna recognize first that this looks kind of like a blue. So I'm gonna start just by putting some of my blue, in my case ultramarine, here on my palette knife. And right off the bat, I can ask myself 3 simple questions to determine whether or not this is actually correct. And I'm gonna start with value. So is what I've mixed up too light or too dark? And in this case, it feels pretty clear. This is too dark. So over here on the working part of my palette, I'm just gonna grab some titanium white. I'm gonna just mix that until it feels like a best guess and bring it back over. And ask, okay, now at this point, is it still too light or too dark? It's actually a little bit hard for me to say exactly what the adjustment needs, but at this point it feels a little bit too light. But the main thing that I'm noticing is actually related to the next question I want to ask, which is this too high of chroma or is it too low of chroma? AKA, is the color I've mixed too intense or too dull compared to the reference material? And I can say pretty confidently, this feels too high chroma. So I'm actually gonna kill 2 birds with 1 stone, or if you don't like that metaphor, I heard the other day, feed 2 birds with 1 scone, and I thought that was delightful. So we're gonna feed 2 birds with 1 scone here. And I'm gonna take some of my transparent oxide red, which when mixed with ultramarine, I just know from practice that it dulls that ultramarine into a really nice gray, because effectively these two are complements of one another. The transparent oxide red is actually a really deep orange, and then our ultramarine, of course, is a blue. So I'm going to take some of that transparent oxide red, which will kill some of the intensity of this color, and it will take that value back down. And I'm just going to go ahead and put that back over top. Okay, great. So here I can once again ask, all right, what do we think about the value? I would say the color that I've mixed, in fact, we can even do a little test of this and say, okay, that value definitely feels too light. So I'm just gonna go back and I'm gonna add a little bit more of that ultramarine, just because I know that's a darker color than the rest of my mixture. And one thing I will do is I will actually take that little daub of paint off of this spot. Well, at least I'm going to try to. It's the beauty of doing this on glass. You can literally just wipe it away. And then I'm going to take my fresh mixture and apply that. I'm just repeating the same questions. Is the value too light or too dark? If there's an issue with value, let's try and fix that as quickly as possible. And what I'm seeing right here is the value, once again, is just too light. And by the way, this definitely gets easier when you mix more color. But because I'm literally just doing this test for YouTube, I'm using pretty small amounts, which is a habit that a lot of painters get into that actually makes working with the paint like annoyingly harder. So learn from my mistake here. Now that I've applied that, it kind of feels like the value is doing pretty well. Now, of course, there's a shadow being cast here because I do have light set up in the studio, so you can actually see this on camera. And there is this shadow off to this side. But if I compare my mixture to the opposite side that's not in shadow, and I squint, it's actually really hard for me to see where the border between the daub of paint and the print that's sitting underneath the glass actually sits. So that tells me that my value is actually in pretty good shape. And in terms of the chroma saturation or intensity, whatever term you want to use, I would say it's feeling like pretty close. It's possible that my mixture is a little bit on the high chroma side compared to Soroya's print here. But the main thing I'm noticing is that my mixture feels like it's tending a little bit toward a greenish blue versus what's underneath feels like it's tending more toward a purplish blue. So that is this question of hue. So to address this, I'm going to take the teeniest amount of my ruby red or permanent rose for those of you not using my exact Vasari palette. And I'm going to go ahead and mix that up. Before I reapply it, I'm just going to wipe this clean. I'm going to apply my, well, if I can get enough paint on my palette knife. Again, one of the problems of working with too little paint and being stingy. What I'm seeing now is the hue isn't really bothering me anymore, but there is now definitely a chroma issue. This is part of why color mixing gets so tricky, because adjusting one thing inevitably will change something else. If you add white to a mixture, it will inherently change the chroma of that mixture, in addition to changing the value. And I think I'm going to take this a little further and just get some more of this transparent oxide red, which is going to reduce the chroma. It will also probably shift the hue just a little bit. And I'm not sure exactly what this looks like for you all on camera. Obviously, you're at a slightly different angle. You're gonna get different kind of glare off of the paint that I've put down. But from my vantage point, what I'm seeing here is that my paint really disappears into this large mass of the rib cage. At least it does on this side that doesn't have the big shadow underneath of it. This is probably one of the trickiest areas that I could have mixed on this particular piece, but just by asking myself these three very simple questions about the value, the hue, and the chroma, I was actually able to match it. That being said, some of you might be thinking to yourselves, well, I mean, that's great, but I have no trouble mixing muddy colors. It's like the really vibrant ones where I get into trouble. So let's go ahead and take a look at that area of a painting. And in this case, I'm probably gonna take a look at this boy's arm. And I think I might go ahead and opt for the forearm that has his hand on the horse's lead rope, close to the halter here. As I look at my palette of colors here, I'm first looking to see like what's really close to this color. And I would say the colors that kind of jump to mind would be like this Terra Rosa, the ruby red, or possibly the Cad Yellow Deep. I actually think the one that's probably like technically closest would be the Terra Rosa. But I know from experience using this is a little bit of a duller color, and I'm gonna really struggle to get it higher chroma if I need to. So I'm actually gonna start with my chroma a little bit too high, and I'm just gonna choose 2 high chroma options. So I'm gonna start with that Cad Yellow Deep, and I'm gonna grab just a touch of that Ruby Red. Now these are 2 very intense colors, so I am being very mindful about the amounts that I'm adding. So I have my first little mixture here. Oh, this is such a small area to match. This might be a little tricky to be able to see on camera. The first thing that I'm noticing is the value seems to be correct. Like if I compare this little dab of paint next to the edge where I can see the forearm and that brighter color, if I squint, I can't really distinguish where the edges are, which again is one of those really helpful value tricks. Where I think we might have some issues are to do with the hue and the chroma. So let's start with the hue first. I think this is just feeling a little bit too orange and it needs to feel a little bit more pink. So I'm gonna take, again, just the tiniest touch of that Ruby Red, maybe a little bit more of a touch than that. Again, this stuff can be really overpowering. I think this might be closer. Again, because it's such a small area, it's a little bit tricky to see, just because it's hard to make a daub that's like quite small enough on this particular print size. Good news is that you can always print something larger if you really wanted to be able to do this more easily. But what jumps out to me right now is that the chroma feels a little bit too high. So I'm gonna grab just a touch of my titanium white, and knowing how intense the cadmiums are, I can probably grab a bit more and it will still feel pretty darn chromatic. And then go ahead and apply it. So once again, I'm kind of running into this hue issue where this feels a little bit too orange and not pink or red enough as the hue. So I'll grab some more of my Ruby Red. Apply that down. So now I feel like the hue looks pretty good. The value looks pretty good. It really disappears when I squint into the surrounding area. I think at this point we're just dealing with chroma that's a touch too high. So once again, I'm just gonna grab some of my titanium white. And that seems to be a pretty darn good match. I could continue adjusting this slightly. Again, just going through those same 3 questions. I think what struck me was that I kind of simultaneously saw a little bit of a hue issue and a little bit of a value issue. And now that feels like a pretty darn good match. Depending on exactly where the camera sees it, there's naturally going to be some variation in what Soroya has painted. So it's not going to perfectly line up with every part of this arm, but this tells me that I am like in the ballpark that I need to be in order to match this color. And I can always kind of zoom in and get even more nuance later. Now, you might be asking like, this is great, but this is not how I paint. My palette is not glass, and I'm not always gonna have my reference right underneath the palette. So this is really just stage 1 of these exercises that I'm talking about here. Specifically, we can do a few things from this point. You could do the exact same exercise, but you could mix it on a normal palette and apply it to an image that is just in a sheet of plastic film, like I've done here with the Cecilia Beau portrait. And you can even take that a step further, and you can paint a small master copy of exactly the same thing. So here on the left, I have the Cecilia Beau print, and here on the right, I have the very simplified color study of this Cecilia Beau portrait. Now it shows up a little wonky on camera just because of the lights and the fact that this is under plastic film right now, but it was a really helpful way for me to test my understanding of the color that I mixed through the simpler version of the exercise. And it shows that I can actually apply all of these effectively on a blank canvas, start to finish. And one other really cool trick that you can actually employ is if you don't want to go through the trouble of putting out all of your paints and actually going through the mixing, you can still go through an exercise that will help you to really hone your skills. And that is to go ahead and get a whole bunch of paint chip swatch things from the hardware store or your local like Sherwin-Williams or whatever it is, and like actually practice putting these onto the print and seeing if they match. So for instance, if I were to look at an area on this top painting that I thought was almost white, I could put down this off-white swatch and essentially run through the exact same tests to realize like, oh, the value of this is actually significantly lighter than this area that I thought was white in the painting. But I could take this swatch and then move it down to the area of the back of the horse and realize, okay, there actually are some spots on this horse that feel roughly like this value. I can do this for areas that can easily play tricks on us as well. So for instance, I can look at the purples of the cloth in this basket full of fish, and rather than like going ahead and leaping right for a super vibrant purple, I can take this like very dull gray purple and put it up here to see if this actually disappears. And there are some little spots on this blanket where that's true. The cool thing about this too is that if you find a match, rather than trying to match it to these individual teeny places on the print, it's way easier to mix up your color and simply match it on this giant card. What this exercise proves isn't just that you have exactly what you need to achieve color like Soroya. It proves something more important. Without clear feedback, you're gonna spin your wheels, and that doesn't mean you've done something wrong, and it doesn't say something about your talent or your potential. That's why so many painters feel like they should be further along by now. They're practicing, but they're doing that inside a system that doesn't actually tell them when they're wrong. This is why I love getting to do what I do, and why I made that guide that you can download to help you out with this. Because I love to geek out about just how much easier painting is when you have the right structure and support to help you on that journey. And once you've done this enough, you can start checking your color mixtures directly against your references on a regular palette. But there's something this exercise doesn't solve. So this system teaches you how to see and mix color accurately. What it doesn't teach is how to get reference with great color, when to exaggerate it, or how far to push color so that it still feels believable while still feeling like really vibrant and engaging. This is where a lot of painters accidentally kill the light they worked so hard to be able to capture with their paint. If you stop here, you'll know how to copy your color, but not how to create it. And what you do make might look correct, but will kind of wind up feeling dead. So watch this video next to learn how to bring gorgeous color into your original paintings step by step.